Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Anderson. My title today is Why Black Lives Should Matter to White People. I grew up in an environment that was blatantly, obviously, totally racist. I grew up in the deep South, South Carolina, in a small southern town. The name of it was Florence. And every part of my life was segregated. My entire town had a section where we called them then colored people lived. They weren't allowed to live anywhere close to or connected to white people. They weren't allowed to go to my church. They weren't allowed to go to any of the restaurants that I ate at. They were not allowed to go to any of the schools that I went to. All of the schools that I went to, from kindergarten all the way up through graduate school. Now, I went to the University of South Carolina. I graduated in 1967, totally segregated. I then went to the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, totally segregated. It wasn't until then I moved to the Boston area at 25 years old. I even began to have any reasonable connection in my daily life with people who were of color, especially black. Now, my hometown, Florence, in the 1940s and 50s, was almost 50% black. But the town was run by the white people, totally controlled. People just like me. And around the age that I was 15 years old, I started to pay attention. I started to realize that something was wrong, something was strange, something wasn't natural. And amazingly, it was my religion that made the difference. My religion was racist. The Southern Baptists were as racist as anybody could ever be. They totally supported segregation. They totally supported, they wouldn't admit to it then, but prejudice against black people. I remember must have been 1964, when the protest against the war in Vietnam was beginning to heat up, and the civil rights movement in the United States was beginning to give birth to itself all across the South. Black people were beginning to approach white churches and ask for membership, just to test out what would happen. And I went to an extremely large Baptist church then in the small town of 20,000 people, maybe 12, 14,000 white people. My church had 1,300 members. On a Sunday morning, the church would be completely full, all the pews of white people. And one day, the minister announced, he said, "We're Southern Baptist, and of course we vote. We have a democratic system in the Southern Baptist Church. Each church is its own organization. Nobody tells us what to do. We vote. We're going to have a vote on Wednesday night, when it's where we usually had prayer meeting on Wednesday nights. We're going to have a vote this Wednesday night about what to do if black people," I'm sure he didn't use the term black people, he probably said colored. "If black people come to this church and want to be members, are we going to admit them into membership? And we're going to vote on it this Wednesday night." I remember going with my friends. I remember being in that congregation that night, and it was packed. It was full. This was a really, really big issue. Should we allow black people to be members of our Christian church? My vote was going to be yes. Now, my minister, I think, at that time had some problem with all of this, and he wasn't as racist as I had imagined he was. And so he said, okay, we're going to vote on this, but it's going to be a standing vote. If you vote yes, you have to stand. If you vote no, you're going to have to stand. So he asked us, if you are willing to have black people be members of this church, please stand up. About 20% of us stood up. 20%. Then he said, if you want to refuse black people from being members of this church, stand up. 80% of the people in the room stood up and voted no. And I was prepared, I think, as a late teenager, given how I've been thinking about these issues already for a few years. I was prepared for most of those white people to be racist and to say no. But I was shocked when I looked across the room and I saw my grandmother and my grandfather vote no. Now, my grandmother, to me, was almost like a saint. I had never seen her say anything bad about anybody. She was always generous and loving and compassionate. And I was shocked that such a person who I thought was close to the epitome of what a good Christian would be had voted no. Now, not to my credit, I never asked my grandmother about that vote. I never brought it up to her. I wish I had, but I think looking back, I was afraid of what she was going to say to me. I was afraid that some part of her racism was going to show its ugly head, and it was going to put a big crack in the image I had of my grandmother's sainthood almost. But it really struck me. What bothered me was how could people who were so devoted to Christianity, to following Jesus, and I was a devout Southern Baptist Christian, always from the time I was a baby, everybody in my family was. How could they love God, love Jesus, follow Jesus, listening to his teachings, and treat black people so badly? Already, I was beginning to ask those questions. I was not getting good answers, and it was a major struggle for me, and to their credit, some of my friends who were my age. And so, by the time I got to seminary, which was 1964, I guess, I was having problems with how the Southern Baptists were reacting in so many racist ways. On the one hand, they were for the war in Vietnam, and that was a war I really thought was not a good war. It was a war we should have gotten out of, and I was really against that. And then, even more important to me than that, was how racist the Southern Baptist churches throughout the South were. And nobody was standing up against it. And so, by the time I got to be a senior in seminary, it's a 3-year program, I decided to leave the Southern Baptist Church. Now, this was something I had been part of ever since I was born. Everybody I knew in my entire family, all of them, were Southern Baptists. And for the most part, pretty devout in their faith. We went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night for prayer meeting. I went to vacation Bible school. We studied the Bible at home. We had prayer and Bible study in my own home on a regular basis. And yet, nobody said this segregation thing is wrong. Nobody said it's evil. Nobody said it's toxic. And so by the time I got to be a senior at my seminary, I had to face, am I going to live in the South and live with these people who were so racist? And so I decided, it felt like a meant to be kind of thing. I found a part-time job in a United Church of Christ right near my seminary. I was the youth minister to youth for about 12, 14 months. And I realized that the UCC, the United Church of Christ, which, by the way, is the denomination that Barack Obama belongs to, they were liberal about race, and they were against the war. And I decided to leave the Baptist, and I was ordained in the UCC in 1970. Now, I look back at my childhood, and I realized until I was about 15 or 16, right in there, I didn't see any conflicts in the fact that there were no black people in my life except for the person that, and the term that was used then was our maid. Now, my family didn't have much money. Both my parents worked. And my mother somehow persuaded my father that she should have a black woman, come and clean the house, usually on Wednesdays. Now, this person, I think, was paid about $8 a day in the 50s. And what was really interesting to me, her name was Josephine, and I came to really care about Josephine. She was really, really good to me growing up. Is she lived in what they call the colored section of town, and all the white women who had, quote, maids would drive over because these black women didn't have cars. They couldn't afford them. All the white women who wanted a maid would drive over to the black section of town, pick up their maid, drive them back to their house. They'd do their cleaning, cooking, whatever they did, and then they'd bring them back at the end of the day. Now, that wasn't the strange part. To me, the strange part was all the white women picked up the black women and put them in the back seat of the car and drove them back and forth as if they were chauffeuring them. But the real reason they put them in the back seat is to put a black woman in the front seat with a white driver meant equality. And these white women did not want to be seen with a black woman in the front seat. Except, to her credit, to this day, I respect and honor my mother for it. My mother always put Josephine in the front seat with her. I remember being in the car with them, and I was in the back seat, and Josephine sat in the front seat with my mother. God bless her. The second thing was, it's really strange to me, I don't know how in the world it never happened. I never heard my mother, my father, any of my aunts or uncles, my grandparents on my mother's side never used the N-word. In fact, my mother went out of her way to tell me it's not to be spoken in this house. I don't know how she got herself to that point. I don't know how she got past the racism and the segregation in the South, because it was rampant. It was everywhere. It was accepted. That's the way it is. I grew up in an environment where there were two flags that were important. I was born in 1945, just 80 years after the end of what was called in the South the war between the states. They didn't call it the Civil War. They saw the South as a legitimate country that seceded from the nation. And I was born just 80 years after that, and there were two flags. There was always an American flag, but there was always a Confederate flag. A flag that was the flag of the states that seceded from the nation because of slavery. The major reason the South seceded was because the North began to put an end to slavery. And the major part of the economy of the South was based on slavery. Every single time I say that out loud, I feel this deep, deep feeling of shame, of horror, that my ancestors, I have had ancestors in this country since the late 1600s. They came from Scotland and Ireland and England and went to South and North Carolina. My ancestors. On my mother's side, they came from England in the early 1700s. All of them. And one day, my uncle came to me and he said, I am really ashamed, but I finally found in our family history someone, I think it was my great-great-grandmother in South Carolina. In her will, she showed that she had 2 slaves. Even in my own family, slave owners. And I am convinced that slavery is the worst disease that human beings visit upon each other. The worst, the most toxic, the most destructive. It destroys a person all the way down into the depths of their soul. And so I was born into that environment where people waved Confederate flags and said, save your Confederate money, boys, the South will rise again. I heard that 10,000 times if I heard it once. I thought the Confederate flag was pretty cool until I began to realize that it symbolized a horrible thing being done to hundreds of thousands of black people. Right there in the environment that I grew up in. And it had that sickness, that toxic sickness had permeated even the religion that I grew up with. Now, the good news about this, I think, is when I was 15, my church taught me to love Jesus, taught me to obey Jesus, taught me to respect deeply the teachings of Jesus. And there were a couple of teachings that hit me so hard that I began to realize there's a difference between being Southern Baptist and being a follower of Jesus. Pretty significant one. The first one, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because I think I'll lose half my audience, but I want you to hear this part. There's a parable Jesus told, a story about the Good Samaritan. You can Google it anytime and you can read the whole thing. But the Good Samaritan occurred because someone said to Jesus, who is my neighbor? Meaning, who is the person that I should care about, is close to me, that I should take care of, that I should support or love? Because in Leviticus, it says, love your neighbor as yourself. And also in the New Testament, it says, love your neighbor as yourself. In the Bible, in Jewish scripture and in Christian New Testament, the same thing. Love your neighbor as yourself. I always thought that was a pretty good thing, pretty wonderful. Jesus said, I'll tell you who your neighbor is. And he told a story about what's called the Good Samaritan. Now, today we don't know what Samaritans are. But in Jesus' time, the Samaritans were people who lived in Israel but were considered unclean. They did not worship God the way the Orthodox Jews had learned to worship God. They didn't even go to the same temple in Jerusalem, they had their own separate way of worshiping, and there were big problems between Samaritans and Jews. And Jesus told a story about a good Samaritan who helped a wounded man out on who had been attacked on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. He helped him out, he saved his life, he paid for him to be taken care of, and Jesus called him a good Samaritan who knew who his neighbor was. Now, in the South, when I grew up, if that story had been told properly from the pulpit, that minister would have said, "Let me tell you Jesus' parable about the good colored man." And he would have been thrown out of town. God knows what would have happened to that minister had he even begun to have that conversation. But that would have been a perfect connection had it been told that way. Because Samaritans 2,000 years ago were considered the same way that white Southerners considered colored people in the South when I was growing up. They were not considered to be whole human beings with whole human and American rights. And so I grew up in an environment of intense racism. And it was so prevalent that almost no one was saying anything about it until the 60s erupted and courageous black people began to stand up nonviolently and risk their lives to try to change that. Well, they made a great start, but obviously it's not done. Obviously, white people, it's not done. Racism is not over. And the worst thing I think we can do as white people to contribute to racism still today is to be silent. If we are silent, we are putting indirectly but powerfully the power of approval, allowing something to exist that should have been cleaned up and changed and healed centuries ago. But now, because of this new crisis, because of this black man that was killed by police, we're having an eruption now of a new kind of consciousness, hopefully one that we as white people are going to support and speak up about in a way that carries us across the line so that we really begin to do things differently in our country. That we really acknowledge we're still racist. We've got to do something about it. Now, I would never say to you that I am not a racist. I was raised in too deep an environment of that to escape it. But the thing is, that's true about all of us in America. Racism has been part of the DNA of this country since the first European explorer put his boot on the sands of the eastern shores of our country. We practiced genocide for years, decades, against Native Americans. In 1619, the first slaves were brought to this country from Africa to Jamestown, Virginia. That's 401 years ago. And we didn't legitimately stop it, the literal slavery in this country, until 1865. And we are still seeing people of color, especially black people, but also people of color, as less than whole and less than legitimate and less than children of God. Now, Jesus had another response. one of my favorite statements, and it hit me when I was a teenager in the middle of my heart, all the way down to the center of it, and I've never, ever, ever been able to let it go. He said to the people who were listening to me, to him, he said to them, as you have done it unto the least of these who are my brothers and sisters, you have done it unto me. What did he mean by that? He meant my divine presence is in everyone you think of as the least of these. And the way to handle that is to consider that they are my presence. He was totally identifying with them. He was saying, no matter who you think is not okay, it's not acceptable, no matter who you're prejudiced against, no matter who you hate, think of that person, those group of people, as you think of me. Then how can we be violent to those people? How can we be prejudiced against those people? How can we hate those people? How can we not reach out to them when they are in need on any level whatsoever? That's a powerful message. It's one of the reasons I love him, as he was capable of saying things like that. And I ask every day, let me heal the racism that still remains in me in any small way, in my mind, in my heart, in my thinking, in my behavior. Reveal it to me. Let me get a handle on it. Let me see it. Let me transform it into compassion and understanding. And I ask you, if you're a white person listening to this and watching this video, I'm asking you, do the same. Speak up. Speak up. And look at yourself and consider, we all, for at least another generation or 2 or 3, should consider ourselves recovering racists who are trying our best to rid ourselves of this terrible disease. If you've gotten this far, all the way to the end of this video with me, then I challenge you to make your own, to speak up your own, and to put it on whatever social media you can. We need to speak up in support of this new level of movement and against racism of all kinds. You can email me at dra@dracoach.com. dra@dracoach.com. God bless you.